So let's finish up with this chapter. We're going to finish with concept 22.3. It says evolution is supported by an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence. So we want to discuss a little bit about this scientific theory of evolution and what that means, and what is the evidence to support this. Why is the theory of evolution, the ideas of natural selection and that type of thing, why is it so widely accepted in the scientific community? Because I know that you hear perhaps in non-scientific publications or in non-scientific circles that evolution is not as widely accepted. As a matter of fact, there was a survey that I just read that came out recently that said a very large portion of the population of the United States does not fully accept this scientific idea of evolution. And I would like to think, I truly would like to think, that's because they themselves have not taken the time to study the evidence for evolution. This scientific idea and scientific theory is as well founded and well supported as any strong theory in the field of science. So if you are someone who accepts cell theory and atomic theory, there is no reason not to accept the theory of evolution. It is just as strongly supported, if not more so. And if you want to understand biology, you have to be able to understand evolution. So let's take a look at some of the evidence for evolution. This pattern and process of evolution is supported by direct observations and something that we're going to discuss called homology and the fossil record and biogeography. And I often think about Darwin and Wallace and other scientists like Gregor Mendel and those people, and if they were alive today, it would blow their minds with the amount of information we now have that backs their various ideas and their thinking. New discoveries continue every day to fill in some of the gaps that identified by Darwin himself in The Origin of Species. Darwin felt very confident in his ideas because even in 1859 he had an enormous amount of evidence to back him, but he knew that there could be more evidence. He wanted more evidence. In science, we always want more data because that leads to greater confidence. And since 1859, since Darwin's life, we have accumulated an overwhelming amount of evidence in favor of evolution. So let's take a look at what some of that evidence is. The first part of evidence we're going to look at is direct observation of evolutionary change. And there are many examples. Your textbook pulls 2 examples to provide evidence for natural selection. And they talk about the natural selection in response to introduced plant species. They're talking about a particular beetle and how it's changed over time based on plant species, and the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. Again, there are thousands of various examples that we could highlight, and I highly suggest you, if you're interested, go and take a look at some of those. I could be happy to point you out to some resources, but we're going to take a look at just these 2 examples that the text provides for direct observation of evolutionary change. In the textbook, one of the examples they talk about is how this particular bug called a soapberry bug, how it has changed based on what plant or fruit is available for it to feed off of. The soapberry bug basically uses a type of beak. It has sort of like a mosquito. It pierces your skin and sucks your blood. Well, the soapberry bug kind of has this beak that pierces fruit and feeds on the seeds within. In southern Florida, the soapberry bug feeds on what's called a balloon vine, which kind of has a fairly large fruit. And those bugs tend to have longer beaks because the longer beak helps you get through the larger fruit down to the seeds. In central Florida, they feed on a different type of plant called a golden rain tree, and the golden rain tree has a smaller, flatter fruit, and so they have shorter beaks. The bugs that tend to feed in central Florida, you're going to find more of them that have the shorter beak. And the correlation between fruit size and beak size has been seen in other states, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Australia. Wherever you find this type of bug, you see this match between size of beak and the primary fruit that they feed off of. There's a great diagram that I'll show you in just a second that kind of shows that match. In all cases, beak size has evolved in populations that feed on introduced plants with fruits that are smaller or larger than the native fruits. So if there is a particular fruit that becomes introduced, say by humans, brought from somewhere else, if that fruit is smaller, over time the beak size of the insects gets smaller. If that fruit is larger, thicker, then over time the beak size of the insects gets longer, larger to adapt to that particular fruit. These are cases of evolution by natural selection, and these can be seen within our lifetime. In Florida, this evolution in beak size was noted and occurred in less than 35 years. So in the span of, only half of a human's life, we can see this evolution in action. We can see this change. And remember, evolutionary change is all about this just slow change over time of creatures. Now some people will say, yeah, but this is just microevolution. The bugs didn't become ducks, or the bugs didn't become some other type of bug. And that's true, but there is this misconception that there is some major difference or chasm between this idea of microevolution and macroevolution. Macroevolution is thought of as speciation, where one species becomes a new species. But that's failing to understand that macroevolution is simply on a larger time scale. There really is no macroevolution. It's just microevolution over extremely long periods of time. Of course not. In 35 years, you're not going to see one species of insect become another. But in 3.5 million years, yeah, you're going to see major speciation and major changes. So consider macroevolution, microevolution over an extremely long period of time. So here's our little bug friend, the soapberry bug. He is beak buried in the fruit, so you can't even see his little pointy beak. He's got it buried in the fruit. He has inserted it into this balloon vine fruit. You can see that it's a fairly large, kind of wide fruit, so he needs a fairly long beak to get through there to get down to the seeds. And then here is the diagram that shows what we're talking about. On the larger fruits, you have the average tends to be toward a longer beak. And then on the more flat, smaller fruits, you have the beak length tends to average toward the smaller beaks. So of course you're going to have a little bit of variety. You're always going to have variety in your data sets. But notice the specimen average tends to be longer, larger on the ones that use the larger fruit, and smaller on the ones that feed on the thinner, smaller fruits. So this is an adaptation. This is on the introduced species. When this plant was introduced, the bugs changed over time and their beaks on average became shorter. That's evolution in action, and we can see that. And this doesn't even go into talking about where you can really see it is things like bacteria and viruses, particularly bacteria because they have such a short lifespan. We see this type of evolution all the time, and they're going to talk about that coming up. Another place that's perhaps more important to humans because it has more dramatic consequences is this idea or this evolution that we can see actually happening, the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. There's a particular bacterium, Staphylococcus aureus, is commonly found on and in people. It doesn't always cause infections, but it can cause certain types of infections. There's one particular strain of this bacterium that is now called methicillin resistant. So it's S. aureus, MRSA. So it's methicillin resistant. Methicillin is a particular drug. It's resistant to this particular drug, and it's called MRSA. So a lot of times in the news they pronounce it MRSA, or similar to MRSA. It's a dangerous pathogen. It's the cause of this condition caused the flesh-eating disease. This S. aureus became resistant first to penicillin. So in 1945, penicillin was introduced or became widely used. This particular strain of this bacteria became resistant to penicillin within about 2 years of the widespread use of penicillin. So only in about 2 years' time, this strain of bacteria pretty much became unaffected by penicillin. So then we had to move on to different, stronger antibiotics, and one of those is methicillin. So methicillin, I keep saying methicillin, but I think it's just methicillin. Methicillin is a stronger antibiotic, and it became resistant to methicillin in 1961. 2 years again after it was introduced. So now we have this strain of bacteria that is very resistant to most of the medicines that we have for it. And it did this very quickly. Only within a couple of years after penicillin began to be widely used and methicillin was widely used, now we have this bacteria that is very dangerous because there's very little we can do to kill it off, to control it. That is a great example of the evolution of this bacteria over time in response to the pressure of its environment. I'm not even going to throw up some pictures here of MRSA infection. If you want to Google that, go ahead. But suffice to say, if you do Google image for MRSA infection or flesh-eating disease, you're going to find some pictures that you're probably going to wish you didn't pull up. So I'll let you do that on your own. But that's a great example of evolution in action that we can see. Methicillin works by inhibiting a protein used by the bacteria in their cell walls. So the way this antibiotic works is it causes a breakdown of the cell walls of the bacteria. Well, this resistant bacteria, the MRSA bacteria, use a different protein in their cell walls. So they circumvent our use of this medication by using a different protein. When exposed to methicillin, MRSA strains are more likely to survive and reproduce than non-resistant strains. So if the MRSA strains are more likely to survive and reproduce, those are the ones that are going to pass on their genetics. They're going to pass on this resistance, and over time all you will have is the MRSA version. Those are the ones that survive. Those are the ones that had the particular adaptation that was useful for their survival. MRSA strains are now resistant to many antibiotics and can be highly dangerous for humans. They have a great picture in your textbook. This is a particular picture or diagram that shows the circular chromosome of this particular bacteria. Remember, bacteria are very simple. They have basically round circular chromosomes. The single circular chromosome, the entire chromosome, the entire genome of this MRSA bacteria has been mapped. And so we even know the various parts of its genome that cause these problems that we're talking about. So starting right at this point, and this is all the base pairs, if you think back to our genetics where we talked about. So this is 250,000 base pairs, 500,000 base pairs in, going around the loop. You're adding up to a total of over 2 million base pairs. See these colored areas? These various colored areas kind of show you some of the various areas that allow for the adaptations that make this particular bacteria so dangerous. So this is something that we can see with our own eyes in our own lifetime. Natural selection does not create new traits, but we need to recall that it edits or selects for traits that are already present in the population. So if natural selection can't create new traits, where do these potential new traits come from? Again, think back to what we talked about in genetics. It's genetic mutations, and what we learned about last semester with DNA replication and meiosis. Sometimes there are mistakes or mutations. Remember, we said oftentimes those mutations are bad, they're not helpful, but sometimes those mutations lead to positive outcomes, to adaptations. Now, once there is a difference, once there is a mutation that is a positive adaptation, that's when natural selection can go to work, and it can basically work toward the various adaptations that are helpful, or it can work against the various mutations or adaptations that are not helpful. And it's the local environment that determines if that adaptation is good or not. Remember, the local environment determines which traits will be selected for or against in any specific population. Again, if you are if you're a fish that lives on a coral reef and the coral all around you is kind of a pink color, and you happen to be born with a pinkish color, well, that would be considered a good, positive adaptation. If you happen to be born with a greenish color, that would be considered negative. But it's the local environment that determines that. You could go to a different reef that had a different coral background color, and those conditions might be swapped. The second line of evidence we're going to take a look at is called homology. Homology is similarity resulting from common ancestry. And that doesn't mean that everything that has an arm that would be a homologous structure. For example, we could look at a lizard, a bird, a human, and a whale, and we're going to see things that are very alike within their arm, and we're going to find out that these are all homologous structures. The bone structure is actually very similar, but that doesn't mean everything with an arm or an appendage is homologous. An octopus, a sea star, a grasshopper, even though they have what you might call an arm or an appendage, they're not homologous because, for example, the octopus arm doesn't even have bones in it, so it is not the same as the ones that we're looking at over here. So you can't say, well, every leg is homologous to every other leg, but if you look within the structure of that appendage or the structure of that body part, you may find what we call homologous structures, and that's what we're going to be taking a look at next. Hard to say. Homologous structures are anatomical resemblances that represent variations on a structural theme present in a common ancestor. So what that means is if we look at these various creatures, we can see where they have things in common. We can also see how those body parts perhaps have changed over time, but they started with the same basic layout. You would expect the skeletal forelimb of all primates, say chimpanzees and humans and gorillas, you would expect all of the skeletal forelimbs of those creatures to be pretty much alike because, well, look at us, we look very much alike, our arms look very much alike. But what if we go to some different creatures? Like what if we compare the forelimbs of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat? Now yes, they're all mammals, which means they all have a commonality. They actually share a common ancestor, but why would their forelimbs all be very much alike? A human uses its forelimb to lift and grab and carry things. A cat uses its forelimb to walk, a whale to swim, a bat to fly. There's really no reason for all of them to be very similar, and yet if we look at the bone structure, they are very similar. Such structures would be, it would seem that they would be highly unlikely if they had arisen anew in each species, but it makes a lot more sense when we see this as a variation on a theme that was inherited from a common ancestor. So if we look at the bone structure of these creatures, so we have a human, a cat, a whale, a bat, you would find from the shoulder to the fingertips a huge amount of things that are alike. As a matter of fact, the bone layout itself is alike. You start with a large bone, and then that leads to two thinner, smaller bones together, and that leads to a number of bones joined at this point, and then we get these longer, thinner bones toward the end. You find the exact same bones. Now no, they're not all exact the same shape, but they have the same layout, and over time, of course, they have changed to make this creature adapted to what it does. But unless they share a common ancestor, there would be no real reason. If these all developed separately and independently, there would be perhaps more efficient ways to develop a limb for flying or a limb for swimming, as opposed to all of these similarities that we see. So those are homologous structures. Another place to find homology is when you compare embryos, developing creatures. Comparative embryology also reveals anatomical homologies that you don't see once the creature becomes an adult. So for example, at some point in their development, all vertebrate embryos, that would be all creatures with a backbone, the embryos at some point have a tail located posterior to the anus, as well as structures in the throat area called pharyngeal pouches or throat pouches. These pouches ultimately develop into different structures with different purposes. So like in fish, these pouches develop into gills. In humans, they develop into parts of the ears and throat. In most mammals, they develop into parts of the ears and throat. But why would the embryos of these very different creatures have some of these same structures unless they shared some commonality? So here on the left we have a chick embryo, and so here you have, this is a light microscope view of both. Along the neck area here you see these pharyngeal pouches, and then you see this tail, this post-anal tail. And here we have a human embryo, and it has a post-anal tail, and it has these pharyngeal pouches. Now, these pharyngeal pouches become part of the neck and throat and ear of the human, and the human pretty much loses its tail, where the chick embryo retains some of its tail and its pharyngeal pouches become another part of its body. But almost all vertebrates have these features at some point in their embryonic development, and that's another good example of what we call homology. One last good example of homology is what we call vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are basically leftovers. They're remnants of features that perhaps serve some sort of function or purpose in the ancestors of an organism. For example, you can find many snakes that have vestigial remains of a pelvis and leg bones within their body. If you dissect them, they don't have legs that they use, obviously, but you'll still find pelvis and tiny little bits of a leg bone because snakes developed from once-legged creatures. Same thing with whales. There are many whales that, although they don't have hind legs, they don't have a need for the pelvis and the leg structure of a land animal, they have vestigial remains of these bones. Also, another good example is like cavefish. Cavefish that are blind, they don't have eyes. They actually have scales that cover their eye area, similar to the scales that cover the rest of their body, but underneath those scales there are the remains of eyes, vestigial eyes. We wouldn't expect to see these if these creatures had originated separately from other vertebrate animals, but we might expect to see these if these creatures originated from a common ancestor and then lost the use of that part or adapted, evolved, changed over time. Examples of homologies at the molecular level, which Darwin could not have even dreamed of. Genetics provides so much evidence for this idea of common descent. These homologies at the genetic level, the fact that all living creatures use RNA and or DNA as the information transfer for their cells, for themselves. The fact that the material that makes up, say, the RNA, the material that makes up the ribosomes, the ribosomal subunits that create proteins, are shared almost with every living creature on the planet. These are genetic homologies or molecular level homologies that also point to this idea of a common ancestor. We talked earlier about Carolus Linnaeus and his taxonomy, and these evolutionary trees are a good example. An evolutionary tree they're basically a hypothesis about the relationship among different groups, and homologies form basically little nested patterns within these evolutionary trees. In the past, evolutionary trees were primarily built based on anatomy. But now we most often use genetic evidence, DNA sequence, to kind of create these evolutionary trees. So the old trees don't necessarily all match the new trees, because what we thought was, okay, this creature and this creature look a lot alike, so perhaps they are closely related. But then when we look at their genetics, we don't always find that to be true. But the idea of an evolutionary tree is still a good model for thinking about how creatures are related. Again, the way to look at an evolutionary tree is to note where the most recent common ancestor occurs. So, for example, in this group that we call birds, ostriches and hawks and other birds are fairly closely related. And that's because they share a common ancestor right here at this point, which, if you're moving from left to right, this was most far back in time, and this is the recent, basically the recent past or the current time. So, not too distant past, the ostriches and the hawks and other birds share a common ancestor. If you go farther back in time, all birds share a common ancestor with the crocodiles. And if you go further back in time, all of these creatures share a common ancestor with lizards and snakes. So you have these break points at which you can see certain characteristics of this shared common ancestor. So like if we look at this particular chart, this particular tree, would you say that mammals are more closely related to amphibians or birds? Here's a mammal right here, represented by the coyote. And would you say he's more closely related to amphibians or birds? Well, if you answered amphibians, you've made a mistake. You might be looking at, well, he's right next to the amphibian, so that means he's most closely related. But remember, you have to backtrack and look at the most common ancestor. So if you backtrack and you're looking, where does it branch off to birds? Well, at point 3, right here, there's a common ancestor between all mammals and then all other creatures, including birds. So point 3 would be the common ancestor between mammals and birds. You have to go back one step further to point 2 to find a common ancestor between amphibians and all other creatures. That would include mammals as well. So mammals are more closely related to birds than they are amphibians. That would be the proper way to read this particular tree. Remember I said back in the, say, the 1800s and even the early 1900s, we used to build these trees based on physical attributes, anatomy, and things like that. But sometimes we develop problems there because some creatures that look a lot alike, they turn out not to be that closely related after all. And now that we have genetic information, that becomes quite clear. One of the causes of this is something called convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is the evolution of similar or analogous features in distantly related groups. Analogous traits arise when groups independently adapt to similar environments in similar ways. Convergent evolution does not provide information about ancestry. So sometimes you have two different creatures, say in two different parts of the world, but maybe they both live in a jungle environment. And so because they live in a similar jungle environment, over time they may have certain traits or adaptations about them where if you looked at them separately you might say, oh, they seem to be very similar, they look alike. But then it may turn out to be that that was convergent evolution. They look alike because they changed, evolved over time in similar type environments. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are related to one another in any close way. So if we say something is analogous, if it's an analogous or analogous feature, that is similar function but not common ancestry. If we say homologous, that means common ancestry, but it doesn't necessarily mean similar function. So let me give you an example. You can find two creatures, one who lives in Australia, it's called a sugar glider, and one who lives in North America, it's a flying squirrel. And if you were just to look at them, you would say, my gosh, they look a lot alike. They must be closely related because they look very similar. They have very similar physical traits, but they're really not very related. The sugar glider is a marsupial. He's more related to a wombat and a kangaroo and a koala bear than he is this flying squirrel. So why do they look so much alike? Well, they grew up or they evolved over time. Their populations evolved over time in similar environmental conditions. So those similar environmental conditions put the same type of pressures on their species and they evolved convergently. So convergent evolution led to similar physical appearance despite the fact that they lack homology. They're not very much related to each other. So homology means they're related to each other, but that doesn't mean they always look alike. Analogy or analogous or convergent evolution means they may look alike, but not necessarily are they related. So that's one example of how these trees can change depending on what type of information you're using to create them. Another line of evidence supporting the idea of scientific evolution is the fossil record. Even in Darwin's time, he collected multiple fossils and he felt, and the evidence showed, because of these fossils, this idea of evolution was a sound one. The fossil record provides evidence of the extinction of species and the origin of new groups and new species and changes within groups over time. And unfortunately, in non-scientific circles, there are many misconceptions about the fossil record and the evidence for evolution that the fossil record provides. First off, you have to recall that fossilization only occurs or occurred in certain locations under certain circumstances. Fossils will never be able to provide a complete record of past life on Earth, and nor does any reputable scientist expect it to, because remember, fossils can only occur usually in sedimentary rock, so the creature would have to die in a particular way, in a particular place, and be covered up in a particular amount of time. And then plus, the finding of fossils can be such a difficult job sometimes that no scientist expects to have a complete record of past life through fossils. But fossils do provide an enormous amount of information, and with every passing year, paleontologists uncover even more and more evidence that points to this idea of evolution. The evidence that fossils do provide is overwhelming. It was large in Darwin's time, and it is just amazingly overwhelming at this point. As a science teacher, I would ask you to dismiss most of what you read and hear about missing links and transitional fossils if you're not reading that information in a scientific article or a scientific magazine or journal. If you're reading that information or seeing that information on TV and Facebook, I would ask that you dismiss it or judge it fairly strongly, because most scientists would tell you that all fossils are transitional fossils. Any fossil you find is a link between even more previous life and current life. And you could even say that all currently living species, or all species, living and extinct, they all represent basically this unbroken thread from the beginning of life on Earth to the present day. So you could say that every fossil is a transitional fossil and that every species is a transitional species. Now, do we have the complete thread from beginning to current day? Of course not. But with every passing year, we find another piece of that thread, and the evidence always points to this idea of this continuing thread from the beginning of time till now. So every fossil is a transitional fossil. Every species, even the species that survive today, human beings or the apes that live today or the elephants that survive today, they are transitional species between the ancient creatures that no longer survive and the creatures that will be here in millions of years from now. The elephants we have today will probably not be the same in 65 million years. So you could say the elephants of today are transitional between what used to exist and what will come to evolve over time. So I would ask that you seek out legitimate scientific sources for your study, including scientific sources for your study of fossils and what they provide as far as evidence for evolution. Just so we don't continue on too long, I'm just going to give you one brief example of what fossils can do. Fossils can document important transitions, for example, the transition from land to sea in the ancestors of cetaceans, which are the marine mammals such as whales and dolphins, and even how modern whales are related to modern deer and pigs and cows and things like that. So we can look at an evolutionary tree and we can see certain things based on homology, based on the bone structure and fossils. We can find a common ancestor between the, say, the deer and the hippopotamus of today and the whales of today. Now you have to go pretty far back to find a common ancestor between all of these creatures. So right about here would be the common ancestor between deer and current whales. There are many types of cetaceans that no longer exist. We do have fossils and different fossil record information of these creatures, but they represent sort of a movement, an evolution from land-based creatures back to the sea-based whales that we see today. And how would we possibly know that, say, a whale is in any way related to a deer? Well, again, bone and fossil information can help provide that for us. If we compare most mammals, if we're looking at, say, this particular bone is an ankle bone, most mammals have this shape of ankle bone where on one end it has 2 points and the other end has a single point. If we compare that to, say, a deer or a pig, we see they have 2 points on either end. And if we compare that to some of the ancient cetaceans that led to the modern whales, we also see the 2 points. So this is, again, more evidence that kind of points to the fact that modern day whales are in some way related to modern day deer and pigs and hippos and things of that way. So that's just an example of how fossil information can help us determine how creatures are related to each other and how things have changed over time. The last line of evidence we're going to take a look at for evolution is biogeography. Biogeography is the study of the geographic distribution of species, and it also provides quite a bit of strong evidence for evolution. At one time in our distant past, the Earth's continents were united in a single large continent I'm sure you've heard of called Pangaea, and then over time those continents separated by what we call continental drift. If you understand this continent movement, you can see the modern distribution of species, how that has changed over time, and it even allows us to predict when and where different groups have evolved and where you're going to find evidence for different groups. So biogeography is the study of how species have spread out across the globe, and it's related to geology. It's related to this idea of continental drift and shifting, moving plates and things of that nature as well. A great example of this can be found on islands. On islands you have a lot of what are called endemic species. Endemic species are species of plants and animals that are not found anywhere else in the world except for that one particular spot. And islands tend to have a lot of endemic species. Now, these species may be closely related to the species on the nearest mainland or other large island, but they are separate. They have become changed enough that you would call them a separate species. Darwin's ideas explain that species on the islands gave rise to new species as they adapted to their new environments. So if a creature moved from the mainland to an island, the island environment was probably different enough that over time natural selection and evolution occurred, and that eventually that creature on the island would be considered a different species, would not interbreed with the mainland creature that they originally came from. As Darwin noted in The Origin of Species, most island species are closely related to a species found on the nearest mainland or other island. So if you look at two islands with similar environments in distant parts of the world, you're probably not going to find species populating those islands that are closely related, even though you may find a lot of analogy. So like if we look at two tropical islands in two different parts of the world, you may find a lot of creatures that seem similar on those two islands. That will be convergent evolution because they evolved in a similar environment. But I bet if you look at them closely, if you study their genetics and other information, you'll find that those species, even though they may look alike or they may have adaptations that are similar, they are not very closely related. They would be more closely related to the mainland creatures near that island than they would to each other. And so that's part of biogeography and the study of the spread of animals and species across the earth over time. Your text finishes up with a very good question, and the question is, what is theoretical about Darwin's view of life? Because we call this the theory of evolution. Some people dismiss Darwin's, and of course it's also Wallace and other scientists, they dismiss Darwin's ideas as, quote, just a theory, unquote. And of course that misunderstands what a scientific theory is. We have seen that the pattern of evolution, the observation that life has evolved over time, has been documented directly and is supported by a great deal of evidence. And in addition, Darwin's explanation of the process of evolution, that natural selection is the primary cause of the observed pattern of evolutionary change, makes sense of the massive amounts of data. The effects of natural selection can be observed and tested in nature, and that's an important part of a scientific theory. So keep in mind what a theory actually means in science. It's a broad idea with explanatory power that pulls together a lot of facts, observed pieces of information. It can be tested and experiments can be done, and all of this is true regarding the theory of evolution. So to say it's just a theory is a misunderstanding of what that word means in the science vernacular or in the science vocabulary. In science, a theory accounts for many observations and data and attempts to explain and integrate a great variety of phenomena. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection integrates diverse areas of biological study, stimulates many new research questions. Ongoing research adds to our understanding of this idea of evolution. And despite what you might hear via non-scientific channels, the acceptance of the theory of evolution is almost universal among scientists, in particular scientists who study biology. It would be very hard to find a noted, respected biologist who does not accept the scientific facts and the scientific theory of evolution. The various specific mechanisms, exactly how evolution occurs and what causes it, yes, those are still being investigated and debated and tested and argued about. That's what's supposed to happen. That's how science works. But the idea itself is as strongly supported as germ theory or atomic theory or any other scientific theory that you've studied in your life. So if you want more information, I'm happy to provide it. There are two great links right down here. This one is from Berkeley out there in California, one of the big universities. This was from PBS. Both of these links can provide you hours of reading material about evolution, and I would encourage you to seek out your own research, but please, I warn you to do that in scientific circles. If you're going to look for scientific information, you should do so through scientific channels, and that way you get the most accurate information that you need to make your decisions about what you think about what you're hearing and seeing and reading. Finally, I wanted to end with this one last little clip, or this last little piece of information. Although Darwin's theory attributes the diversity of life to natural processes, the diverse products of evolution nevertheless remain elegant and inspiring. Some people tend to think that if you accept evolution, you are somehow denigrating the beauty of the world around you, that somehow the scientific way of thinking about the world makes it less beautiful or less inspiring. And I would bet that no scientist you talk to would believe that, would say that. As Darwin wrote in the final sentence of The Origin of Species, quote, "There is grandeur in this view of life, in which endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." And so I would be hesitant if you were to say that accepting evolution and accepting the scientific viewpoint of the world somehow makes the world less beautiful or less poetic. I certainly disagree with that, and I think most scientists would disagree as well. We're going to stop right there. I hope you've enjoyed this chapter. We're going to move on to our next chapter soon. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.